I have had occasion, I fancy, to speak before now of these pick-me-ups of Jeeves and their effect on a fellow who is hanging to life by a thread on the morning after. What they consist of, I couldn't tell you. He says some kind of sauce, the yolk of a raw egg and a dash of red pepper, but nothing will convince me that the thing doesn't go much deeper than that. Be that as it may, however, the results of swallowing one are amazing. You are listening to Filthy Armenian Adventures, and today we are going to introduce ourselves, or reintroduce ourselves, to the great peace and timeless delight of P.G. Wodehouse, the most successful comedic fiction writer in the English language. It's a reintroduction for me. 16 years ago, I was cured of a bad fever by finally reaching over and opening a little blue mass market paperback that had been yellowing by my bedside for years. It was called The Inimitable Jeeves. And as I wrote in July 2010 in the Summer Books feature of Liberty magazine, quote, after the first story, featuring the sublimely wise and cunning valet Jeeves, his charmingly inferior employer Bertie Wooster, and Bertie's friend Bingo Little, a glutton for true love, I was hooked. If it didn't exactly cure my fever, at least it made me want to be cured. Comedy comes in two general forms. One is overtly dark, serious, the humor working deep undercover. The other is apparently light and frivolous, with the seriousness in disguise. Wodehouse practiced the latter kind. He called his stories musical comedies without the music, and I would call them musical comedies with the comedy. This explains why his books feel to me like distinctly literary versions of my favorite television shows, with zany schemes, elusive romances, fearsome aunts, socially reputable morons, plots woven by hilarious miscommunication, opportune drinking, and gambling. Wodehouse created a comic paradise, energized by sheer delight. Wodehouse, who lived from 1881 to 1975, wrote over 100 books, and surely many of them are to be avoided. Possibly you once started one of the duds and saw nothing in it. It's a Murphy's Law of funny book giving, that the title you receive as a gift will never be the author's best. Either you get one of those cheap anthologies of lesser work, or the gift giver, having read and loved one particular book, decides to get you a different one by the same author, considering the pleasure he got from the first to be enough for you both. End quote. I was Bertie Wooster's age when I wrote those words, 25. So I felt like it was time to revisit Wodehouse from the maturity standpoint of someone more like Jeeves. I only read one book before recording this episode with my English friend Yeerk, because there was no time to assign an entire oeuvre. Maybe an oeuvre would have been doable, but an oeuvre was simply too much to assign. Nevertheless, after recording, I have not stopped taking doses of the oeuvre, and as I have found over the course of July, the more of the Wodehouse oeuvre you drink, the deeper the piece, the more satisfying, the more you get it, and so long as you're drinking from the top shelf. For this convo, we read Carry On Jeeves, a collection of stories, which opens with the one in which Jeeves is first hired by Bertie, inserting himself instantly to his employer's graces by the immediate production of that hangover cure. I'll provide a list of titles in the notes of this episode for how you should book your stay at the P.G. Wodehouse Resort and Casino. I haven't read all the books or even most of the books, but I do know the ones you should start with, the solid Jeeves and Wooster stories and a few others that you should absolutely start with before you venture out into the other wilds where things get a lot more debatable. A starting point, I will put that in the notes beyond the paywall, but for the starting point, either the one we read for this, Carry On Jeeves, or The Inimitable Jeeves, the first one I read 16 years ago, will suffice. Since recording this episode, a few important matters have come to my attention. One is that the big 250 is secretly an ideal time to appreciate PG, because America had a profound influence on the author and the man. Wodehouse really lived here most of his life. He not only lived here in exile from England following his innocent blunder with the Nazis during World War II, which we'll get into later, he also spent his most creatively formative years here cutting his teeth in Broadway and Hollywood, where he founded the Hollywood Cricket Club in 1930, without which we don't have Eva Lenoir's novel The Loved One, without which we don't have Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. And while it all seems British to the virgin reader of today, Wodehouse's language was a transatlantic brew thick with American slang, like Ranny Gazoo. And even apart from his countless triumphs of comic phrasing, like the acrid smell of burnt poetry and endless amounts where that came from. And even beyond his, really, really beautiful character naming like Gussie Finknottle and Bingo Little and Honoria Glossop and on and on and on. Wodehouse invented a large number of phrases that are so perfect that they've become part of our common everyday language without anybody knowing it. Phrases like these simple things like loony bin and down to earth. Down to earth. He didn't invent if you know what I mean, but he popularized it extremely. He used it as such a crutch in a way that indicated he understood the power of that phrase, if you know what I mean, which has not abated at all through all these decades. But down to earth, I've always loved that phrase, and I got really excited when I found out he invented that one. In a perfect agony of boredom with London in the 1920s, Wodehouse wrote, quote, "All I want to do is get back and hear that American language again." So without America, there is no Wodehouse. And without Wodehouse, would there always be an England? Happy 250th to our friends across the pond. On that note, I have to offer my own little discovery to the canon of Wodehouse scholarship. It is well known that he and Raymond Chandler just missed each other as classmates at Dulwich. And just as there's no Wodehouse without America, there is no Raymond Chandler without England. And the knack both of them share for the comic simile is hard to miss. But there is a direct and perhaps more revealing rendezvous between their literary worlds that I haven't seen anyone else point out in all the many fine Wodehouse critical essays I've been reading the last few weeks. There's a scene in Thank You, Jeeves when Bertie Wooster returns to his bedroom to find his ex-fiancée Pauline Stoker curled up in his bed wearing his heliotrope pajamas. And Bertie says, "The attitude of fellows towards finding girls in their bedroom shortly after midnight varies. Some like it, some don't. I didn't." CF, as they say, the scene in The Big Sleep when Marlowe comes home to his apartment in Hollywood to find a naked Carmen in his bed and exhibits much the same attitude, I would say, in much the same manner with a similar cadence of language, if only with a slightly more violent conclusion in which he tears up the bed. So there is my contribution to Wodehouse literary history and scholarship. That scene was inspired. The Big Sleep scene was inspired by that story. 100%. Christopher Hitchens actually was fond of quoting that Marlowe foreshadowing scene when advancing a hopeful theory developed over 3 passionate essays across the decades about Wodehouse, whom he revered, that there might have been an element of the "oh, how's your father" lurking deep beneath the surface of the mind behind Blanding's castle, the father being Oscar Wilde. Hitchens found it highly suspicious that of all the voluminous literary references the erudite Wodehouse deployed for comedic gold, not one mention was ever made of Oscar Wilde or the importance of being earnest whose two opening lines between Algernon and his butler seemed to encode the entire inspiration of Bertie Jeeves. "Did you hear what I was playing, Lane?" "I didn't think it polite to listen, sir." He's playing the piano. Yes, it's a good point. It's exactly what he's right. So how could the psychology of the individual, as Jeeves would say, explain PG's exclusion of Wilde alone from his literary universe? Wrote Hitch. "Between Wodehouse and Wilde there is an enormous gulf apparently fixed. Both died in exile, having been meanly treated by a culture that prides itself above all on having a broad and keen sense of humor. Both were vilely baited by the pseudo-lions of a cowardly establishment. Both were tougher eggs than they looked, and both thought the class system an absolute scream. It would be encouraging to think that an unacknowledged, latent tie existed between the louche Irishman, is it louche or louche? Whatever it is, louche, and the reticent minor public schoolboy, because only by brooding on such connections can we hope to save the idea of English humor from the drawing room and saloon bar conscription that is eternally levied upon it by bland Loamshire wits like Mr. Phelps, the biographer that Hitchens was reviewing. Unfortunately, by the end, Sweet Christopher had to donate his theory to the doorman like one of Bertie's purple neckties, when a grad student informed him that the story Pigs Have Wings indeed does contain a laborious, page-long riff on the importance of being earnest. Of all the essays I read on Wodehouse, it was Evelyn Waugh who took the words out of my mouth. Quote, "Literary characters may survive either through being so real and round that they are true of any age and race, or through being so stylized that they carry their own world with them. Of the second are Mr. Wodehouse's characters. They live in their own universe, like the characters of a fairy story. Jeeves knows his place," says Mr. Wodehouse in the introduction to the Jeeves Omnibus, "and it is between the covers of a book. That is his secret. Just as, say, the sculptured figures on the west front at Wells are patently sculptured figures, exciting a purely aesthetic interest, not a lot of real old ladies and gentlemen whose precarious position would move us to thoughts of calling out the fire escape and getting them down. So Mr. Wodehouse's characters are purely and essentially literary characters." End quote. Being purely and essentially literary characters, I say, their society is an achievement unlocked by those who develop the increasingly niche capacity to enjoy literature and to have a conscious relationship with language and the language that surrounds them. In 1939, Waugh accurately predicted that Wodehouse will, quote, "continue to release future generations from captivity that may be more irksome than our own." Every time I hear the TV in my hotel room that I'm in right now say, "There is an old Georgian proverb that every guest is sent from God," I imagine it being quoted by Jeeves upon the arrival at some ungodly hour of Aunt Agatha or Gussie Fink Noddle, and Bertie replying, "Next time you see the ancient Georgians, tell them I think they're full of hachaburi," or words to that effect. Of course, an Eden must be free of political gas, though much has been speculated of PG's politics since he's one of those writers that every side wishes to claim. Leftists will cling to his portrait of Roderick Spode, the Nazi with a secret passion for women's underwear, in Code of the Woosters, 1938. Rightists will point to the story Comrade Bingo and its portrait of Bolshevik poseurs, for whom Jeeves displays a personal disgust and contempt, not shown for any but the most egregious pair of Bertie's spats. A comment from his story Gentlemen of Leisure, dismissed by Orwell as ignorant, would seem to close the case, and the line is, "A burglar is only a practical socialist. People talk a lot about the redistribution of wealth. The burglar goes out and does it." I won't get into the weeds right here about why and how Wodehouse was canceled in England for his blunder during World War II. But as I've read into it a little bit, one can absolutely detect in that censorious and nasty spectacle the workings of communist activity. They know an enemy when they read one. We know now, perhaps more than ever, that the very decision to sideline politics from your reality is itself a political act. There's no way around it. It'll be viewed as a political act by those for whom nothing but politics exists. Most people who place their hopes and dreams in the theory of paradise on earth will resent anyone who merely achieves paradise in the practice of literature. All right, I think I've said enough for now. I just had to add all that extra stuff because we did record this very early in the process of my rediscovery of Wodehouse. Now I'm going to go prepare a pitch deck for a diversity POC adaptation called Axe Jeeves. And I hope you enjoy this introduction to the PG Wodehouse Resort and Casino, where it's always bros before right hoes, where you may lose your shirt at Baccarat or the Great Sermon Handicap, but you'll never lose your desire to be romantically disentangled from a health-conscious e-glossop who's fond of quoting Nietzsche. You are listening to Filthy Armenian Adventures, and I am back with my old chap from London to discuss a very, very exceedingly, overwhelmingly English genius, the literary comedian, farce artist of all time, P.G. Wodehouse. And no one better to discuss it with than Yeerk, the world-famous Yeerk, host of the Bistro Californium show, and a major rabble-rouser online, a voice of moral probity on the internet. How's all the local raping going, Yeerk? How's the rape scene in England these days? To broach a subject that would never appear anywhere close to the world of P.G. Wodehouse, where nothing evil ever happens except for a mean aunt.
You know, I'm no expert on it. I guess where I've always made my contribution is like in the sort of area of rhetoric, or like just unpicking the kind of like strategies people come up with to like dismiss and deny and minimize this type of stuff. But there was a development recently with the grooming gang inquiry report that came out.
Yeah.
Which, you know, it's very sort of important and timely. And it was put out by like the Rupert Lowe kind of restore faction of the British right. And you know, it's a worthwhile document. It's very important and stuff. But at the same time, there are guys like Adam Wren. I don't know if you know of him.
I don't know
Like
anybody in England.
No, he's a guy. He's been incredibly like important in. I mean, he like sort of led this project to get the courts to release the court transcripts of the grooming gangs and stuff, right? So the release of this report has led to a little bit of a split because there is some, you know, I think valid criticism from some other of these right-wing factions, British right-wing factions, that it's sort of like somewhat lacking in rigor. The biggest point of contention is the sort of like 250,000 victim figure, which was sort of like, I believe was calculated from taking the known numbers from that we like know of from specific places, and then kind of like just assuming that holds for every, you know, region in the UK where there's been
like a little bit of like a rape algorithm sort of going on there.
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
The same thing,
right.
The same way they determine how many people supposedly die of the flu every year.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. So,
yeah,
it's and the problem is there are people who are in two minds about this. There are people who are just sort of like arguing for this, this just being naked propaganda and it being good in this sense. And then I think the concern is that, this is an issue which is like struggling to achieve political recognition, right? And so I think things like this, they sort of like harm the credibility of the issue a
yeah.
little bit.
It
Not that,
feels like bullshit to me. It definitely feels like
mm,
bullshit to me. And I wouldn't, I wouldn't recommend the grooming gang report as a beach read for the summer. Probably, I don't think
no,
it's not quite a Woodhouseian romp, but
it is not.
you know, to me, it's a little bit frustrating because it's like you have to create this. I don't know if you have to, but the impulse seems to be normal, regular, outrageous activity is not enough to create any kind of change. So you have to like hyperbolize and hyperbolize and hyperbolize, and then in the process of doing that, you lose credibility, and it's this weird cycle that we're in. I mean, to me, what happened to
Yeah,
his name is Henry Lovac. What was his name?
Nowak.
Nowak, the guy who
Yeah,
got the police who got stabbed, and then the police didn't believe him because they called him a racist, and then they just let him die. Like
yeah.
that to me is that's all I need to hear. Like that's all it takes
Well,
to
yeah, yeah.
burn
I
down the
mean, and
entire operation.
that's already out of the news cycle and has been pretty much forgotten about. And it was only like what, like so many weeks ago.
Yeah, it was a few weeks
But
ago, and everyone was like talking. Yeah, it's a weird
yeah,
situation you guys are in. I don't mean I didn't I just was being kind of light. I didn't mean to like really. I don't want this to be a rape to be a talk about the horrible
no, sorry,
situation in
no,
England.
no. It just like I mean, the other thing is that this report. I mean, I'm looking at the PDF now, and it begins with these. Like, we can move on to the sunnier pastures of PG Woodhouse, but it begins with this fake quote from Albert Einstein. The world is a dangerous place to live,
Of
not
course.
because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. That real pithy time when Albert
Oh
Einstein said,
yeah,
"Because of the people who don't do anything about it." I mean, the pithiness of,
yeah.
and
The
then
pithy of
underneath we have
yeah. What happened to
people don't do
all
anything
that?
about it.
You don't do anything about who people who just don't people who just aren't willing to be proactive. The great quote.
It's just that those eloquent
Tho-
words of Albert
Those
Einstein,
who are
and
evil,
then
those who are evil get away with it all the time due to all the people who aren't willing to be proactive enough
something
to
like that.
stop them.
And then underneath you have "Man is the cruelest animal," Friedrich Nietzsche, which is like this is the kind of quote that you see at the beginning of like like a Gears of War trailer,
This sounds
like a
corny as hell, and like
yeah.
and very obvious why these guys are
It is as
not
though all
making a
nature
real dent
waited
into things.
breathless.
It's just
But
it's a bit
Then,
embarrassing,
suddenly,
It's a
it
bit
is, it
embarrassing.
It is as
it's
if the
it's
last
it's just
trump had sounded.
there is a lack
Judgment Day
of
set in with
real
unusual
seriousness, and that's
Bonfires
kind of the
burst
problem
out all
that
in parts of the
plagues,
frame.
I think,
The abdomen
these
becomes
various
heavily
resistance
charged with molten
movements
lava.
up and down. I mean, it's
great
just they're
wind
they're
seems to
catnip
blow
for
through the world,
just
and the
impotent
subject is
rage,
aware of something
and
resembling
the
a
impotent
steel
and there's nothing wrong with
striking the back of his
with
head.
like for rage to become
During
potent.
this phase,
It has to be serious. It has to be
ears ring
organized,
loudly,
and it has to be
eyeballs
strategic.
rotate,
And this is
and
just
there is
sort
a
of like,
tingling about the
oh,
brow.
girls are getting raped. Let's get
Then,
mad.
just as you are
Abstract
feeling that you
girls'
ought to
digits
ring up your
on
lawyer
a
and
screen
see
are
that
getting
your
raped.
affairs are
It's
in
kind of
order before
a
it's too
version
late.
of
The whole
Epstein
situation
Island, but with a
seems to
different
clarify.
target.
The wind
And
drops.
it doesn't really
Ears
work.
cease to
It's
ring.
doomed to peter off and
Birds
peter away.
twitter.
I mean, these quotes you're
Brass
reading me,
bands start playing.
they're actually
The
something that
sun
could be right
comes
out
up
of
over the
Woodhouse, a
horizon
fake.
with a jerk.
It's like something Bertie Wooster
And a
would
moment
say,
later,
a paraphrase
all you
or
are
something,
conscious
like
of
a quote to the effect
is
that evil only
Yeah.
triumphs. Evil only triumphs when good posters you don't retweet me quite often enough or something. It's like fuzzy, fake, feel good quotations that you've seen in a million.
Well, you get this thing where occasionally, like Bertie Wooster will like attempt to quote like Schopenhauer or something, you know,
Yeah.
or
Shop,
like,
shop, ship. Yeah, he's like shop, shop.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right, Schopenhauer. It's the best. It's the best part of the books. On one of my favorite parts of the books. Well, first I'll start from the beginning. But my point is that I started with the rape thing only to highlight the kind of the reason for dipping into P.G. Wodehouse, where we are now over like 100 years into his, or even more than 100 years, well more than 100 years into his into the beginning of his output. And it's very, very hard for comedy, literary comedy especially, to survive the times in which it was written. It's just really, really hard. It's so rare. I've got James Thurber in my bookshelf. I've got S.J. Perlman in my bookshelf. I cannot get through a single piece of theirs. It's like impossible. It is absolutely impossible. Even Farewell, My Lovely Appetizer, the spoof of Raymond Chandler, like even that, when I was all up in Raymond Chandler, I just tried reading it and I'm like, I get the joke from the title and that's it. And it's like, that's it. And the whole air has been changed. The climate has changed. Climate change, nothing suffers more from climate change than a joke. And therefore it's really interesting to see whether P.G. Wodehouse survives for people, and I think he has survived quite a long time. And reading him again, I read him about 15 years ago for the first time, and opening up this book again for the first time, basically 15 years. We read. I told you to read Carry On, Jeeves, which is really the first collection of stories that took off and that kind of implanted Jeeves and Wooster, Bertie Wooster, his rich idling boss or whatever it's called. He is of course, if you don't know who Jeeves is the butler, the personal gentleman's personal gentleman.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Who's the brilliant butler of the somewhat dopey Bertie Wooster, dopey but very charming.
Well, not to be a pedant, but I think technically he is a valet.
A valet.
He's like,
that's right.
He's like Bertie Wooster's personal man, whereas I think a butler the butler is like the main guy of the household. So he and he serves everybody.
These are important things to know because we're talking now about a pre-World War I world of aristocracy and of empire. Wodehouse is basically the voice, the comedic voice, but the White Lodge joyful voice of pleasure of the empire, of the British Empire before it collapsed. And I think that his books were best. His best work all came before the collapse of the empire, which is to say before World War II. I think the consensus, and I haven't. He's written 100 books, and I haven't read nearly most of them. I've read plenty of the peak Jeeves work, and I've read some other stuff that I'll recommend. But the consensus from all seems to be that his work was much better pre-World War II, and you want to stick to those, and you don't want to trust an anthology that one of your aunts gave you, one of your mean or kindly aunts. You don't want to trust that because that'll probably have a lot of filler in it and a lot of the later shit. You want to make sure you're reading the right stuff so you really get it. And once you do get it, it becomes a pretty addictive thing to imbibe. And so I'm curious how this landed to you and all the distinctions that kind of reinforce the world of P.G. Wodehouse, this aristocratic world where a guy has no job except to keep his various rich aunts and uncles happy enough to keep the money flowing, and who can afford to have a personal gentleman, and whose primary dramas in life involve bailing out his chums from various jams. Yes. And there's so much about this world that I absolutely admire. I think it's a beautiful fantasy land, and it's a joy to return to it every single time. So, you hadn't read Wodehouse until now, or did you have a background?
I'm not like I wouldn't say I'm like steeped in Wodehouse So I'd maybe like read the odd novel. I've read like maybe a couple of the Blandings Castle novels, and um the same book that I used because I got this book, this is like something I inherited from, you know, it was just in my house. I kind
Yeah.
of appropriated it into my bedroom when I was a teenager. This hardback 90th birthday edition, The World of Jeeves, which contains all the stories from Carry On Jeeves in a kind of
Oh, great.
haphazard order. So I just worked my way through it, and I read a few of the others too. And this is where I first would have encountered PG Wodehouse for the first time. I think when I was a teenager at school, and I just used to, in this kind of very leisurely way that you're kind of supposed to read PG Wodehouse. I think, I would just every now and again, it would be my bedtime reading. I would just like dip into the stories. I didn't really remember any specific details of them. Um, on getting reacquainted this time around. But my house is there are like I mean, there are many bookshelves in my house. My parents have a lot of books. My dad has a lot of books. Um, and almost every shelf, it's very easy to just kind of like run into a PG Wodehouse book of some kind. And I've come across a few of his later works and just like idly leafed through them and had the impression that they're kind of like they're sort of a bit of a dud, you know. Um, but he's always a kind of presence in the house in a way, and I remember asking my dad a long time ago who his favorite writers were, and he said P.G. Wodehouse and why am I forgetting his name? Joseph Conrad.
Right.
Which I think is, so it sort of reveals something interesting about my dad. Those are two very interesting writers to make your favorite. But the whole sort of and I think you're completely right. It is a sort of like fantasy world in a way. Um, this whole fantasy world of this kind of Edwardian English aristocracy who divide their time between flats in London and then these like, beautiful country estates, and then also go on these sojourns in France and in New York. But
For months at
basically,
a time, because you
for
traveled back
months at a
then.
time,
Months at a time,
there's
you'll just
always
be in another city.
there's always the sense of just time just being this like the
Yeah.
world of PG Woodhouse is full of time,
Yeah. Nothing
Um,
but time.
and I also grew up reading Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett, who are just part of the kind of standard middle class British person's reading diet. And Terry Pratchett is kind of twee, but he's like a sort of fantasy take on a very cuddly fantasy take on a similar style to Woodhouse. And then Douglas Adams is also, has a very twee reputation, even though his books are actually kind of a bit sort of downbeat. Um, but if you grow up reading this stuff, which is all downstream of Woodhouse, then you're kind of primed to enjoy him, and again, this Edwardian world is so sort of like comforting, but also fantastic and unfamiliar in retrospect, that it may as well be like a fantasy or a science fiction setting. And um, I think like you, like I have a deep appreciation for this kind of English social comedy type of thing, which and you can trace it way back through Jane Austen and back even further than that. But another significant figure would be like Oscar Wilde, and plays like the importance of being earnest, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that
I mean,
the nonfiction version of Woodhouse would be Max Beerbohm.
yes, yeah,
He's very much in the same line, and he's part of the same conversation about like, does that survive? Does that last? Oscar Wilde to me, yeah, importance of being earnest I think the word is epicene. Is that how it's pronounced?
yes, yeah, yeah.
Epicene, as Camille Paglia describes it in Sexual Personae, and it's this world unto itself that's very end of the century, very could only exist in an aristocratic context, where the stakes are so different from the stakes of those who struggle to make a living in any way whatsoever. They're not middle class. They're not lower class. They're not upper middle class. They are just in a different stratosphere, and that's what kind of really takes the edge off when you're reading them in the present, in any day. I think that's the idea. It's that you're really just transported, and yet it's not, even though it's a fantasy, it's actually very satirically sharp. In the case of Wodehouse, it is superbly well written. I mean, the joy of it is in the language and in his similes, which he's better than anyone at the comic simile. I mean, compared to his classmate Raymond Chandler, not classmate, I'm sorry, but his fellows, a man who went to the same school, Dulwich. Is that how it's pronounced? They both went to Dulwich.
Dulwich, yeah.
Dulwich, okay. They both went to Dulwich, and so did another famous writer I'm blanking out on. And both of them somehow acquired a similar propensity for the comic simile.
Yeah,
but Wodehouse takes it to a completely untouchable level.
But it's also funny because there is a kind of there's the kind of lightest inflection of a sort of detective story structure, in these short stories, right? Like narratively,
completely.
There is a kind of mystery to be solved, and then there is this kind of like also the Sherlock Holmes influence on the character of Jeeves, who has this mysterious facility to just like work things behind the scenes, and also is tapped into this like vast network across the country of servants and
he knows everyone. Yeah, he knows everyone. I want to talk a lot about Jeeves because I think that's an eternal creation of all time, and actually strangely relevant to the most pressing big brain issue of our time, AI. I want to make that connection in a bit and build up to it. But it is power. It's definitely influenced by, I mean, one of his favorite writers was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He was born in 1880. His other favorite was Charles Dickens, and the detective story, it very much is a White Lodge version of the detective story in its plot ingenuity. These are, superbly plotted tales. And the novels, now the best novel by all accounts is Code of the Woosters. And I've read that, but it's been a while. I didn't reread it. And that's the novel where you get to really meet Aunt Agatha, who is referred to in throughout the stories as this menacing, off-screen presence from which Bertie Wooster is always in flight. And you really get to meet her.
Comments about Lady Bracknell in that wonderful part of Sexual Persona where she's talking about the importance of being honest. They're very applicable. I can't really quote them off the top of my head, but they're very applicable to Aunt Agatha. She is like one of these fearsome kind of battle axe aunts. She's
exactly the type of person that Polya would champion and celebrate as a model of true feminism and and female individuality and power, female empowerment. Yeah, the Aunts of Wodehouse is a chapter I would love to read by Camille Polya in Sexual Personae Volume 3, Night of the Arrowheads or whatever, whenever she puts out her Native American fan. That's how I would like her Native American study to be done in the tone of Wodehouse, and just like imagining various Cherokee aunts and Navajo uncles and their quirky ways. The aunts are some of the best part. I vaguely remember the plot of Code of the Woosters, and it involved, as usual, as there are hints of here, it involved, securing, keeping the cook Anatole, I think. That this is just a separate aunt in here. It involved like making sure the amazing magician cook who leaves has to come back, and machinations involved with getting the cook to come back. Machinations involved with getting the uncle to keep writing checks. Her rich husband, who when certain things sour his mood, such as bad food from a bad cook, starts to keep track of all the money he's spending and starts to get really frugal. But when the food is good, the checks are flowing, and she can keep her magazine funded, and she can keep her NGOs funded, and everything else. The ladies, ladies' afternoon NGO for the blighted or whatever. It involves this, at the same time, completely detached reality, but it is also satirically sharp about women, about intellectual pretensions, especially. Wodehouse is extremely well read, constantly referring to, as you said, Schopenhauer. The famous line by Jeeves about Nietzsche. You remember that, which is,
yes,
he's fundamentally unsound, sir, or something.
Unsound.
Yes. The drowsy stillness of the afternoon was shattered by what sounded to his strained senses like G.K. Chesterton falling on a sheet of tin. And so so you see all the intellectuals and the names we all are familiar with. We all know we're still talking about the same names, which is another reason why this shit lasts. Most of the references in here, some of them are beyond anyone's, are Baroque, but most of them are familiar to the well-read person of today or the intellectual person of today. And it's probably one reason why the intellectual, like the elites, have always loved Wodehouse. He was T.S. Eliot, Auden, Virginia Woolf. They all loved him. Everyone loved him. He was truly he was one of the few writers of any genre ever that had just a completely wide appreciation as well as massive popular success. It's very rare for a writer to achieve both. I did an episode on Somerset Maugham last year, and he was somebody whose popularity cost him esteem from the intellectuals severely, and he was very sore about it. Wodehouse is like this angel floating in the sky that no one has any qualms about for any reason supporting, except I'm sure some weirdos, but just about everybody loved him. And on top of that, he made $1 gazillion. And if it wasn't for one massive, disastrous mistake in the middle of his life that we'll talk about, he would have had the perfect life that ever existed, although there was a massive blunder in the middle of it when the Germans invaded France while he was still living there.
Hey, this is your host, Alec Mohibian, with a quick message before we continue. Based in that great but very troubled place, Hollywood, California, Filthy Armenian Adventures is an interdimensional travel program that takes you deep into the cultural mysteries of our time. In search of truth, in search of gold, in search of lost friends and unsung heroes, in search of John Galt's motor. This show is your antidote to the black pill. This is your guide to the places, the personalities, the ideas and creations the enemies of man don't want you to know. This is your techno-noir investigation into the good, the evil, and the God hiding under our noise. This is where you get the news before it breaks, before it blows, before it burns. The show is supported entirely by patrons at patreon.com/filthyarmenian. As a patron, you get access to twice as many adventures, including the most important ones, the ones with the real facts. Plus, regular brief smoke break spiritual reports on topics of the day. As a patron, you also get exclusive access to our Smash live events. Ask anyone who's attended one, and they will tell you it's an experience you'll never forget. It's very easy to keep Filthy Armenian Adventures alive. You can still listen to the show on your favorite app like Spotify or Apple, and you can do so with the pride that you're putting a little bit of money where your soul is. More patrons means more fuel, more topics, more investigations, more miracles, more secret locations, and forbidden territories around the world, and the world that is Los Angeles, our post-apocalyptic headquarters. It means we'll be able to track down more enchanting figures in the landscape, dare them to abandon their masks, and join our quest out of the darkness and into a golden age. Patreon.com/filthyarmenian. Thank you for being one of the good ones, and enjoy the show.